Hey everybody, good to see you again. Professor V back with another lesson. This time we're going to be learning about the president and more broadly the executive branch. So, as we know by now, there are three branches to the federal government. We have Congress, which contains two chambers, the 100 in the Senate and 435 in the House of Representatives. And then we also know that there's the judicial branch, which in the case of the federal government is the Supreme Court, which has 9 members. And then there's the executive branch. And that's where we find the president, vice president, and a lot of other pretty powerful people below them. So let's jump right in. In order to be president, the Constitution sets out three requirements. The first is you have to be 35 years old or older. Now, that may seem kind of young today, especially when you compare, say, Biden and Trump to, the age of 35 seems extremely young. But remember, life expectancy back when the Constitution was ratified was not anything like the life expectancy there is today. So, in that sense, I think it's interesting to think about that 35 back then may have been more like something like 55 years old today, if we were able to do that math. And the next requirement is that the person be born in the United States. And then the third requirement is that if the person moves away from the United States, that they have to come back and have 14 consecutive years of residency in the United States in order to then become president. So I always like to start by asking a question, and I'm going to see. I always hope to catch a few people, and I say that because I want to tell you the truth, and you may or may not already have heard the conspiracy that we're going to dispel right now. But in 2008, there was, we talked about the last class. There were many candidates on the ballot, but obviously the two major party candidates were Barack Obama and John McCain. Now, in this case, it's fascinating because while these two are battling it out on, the campaign trail and so on and so forth, there became a rumor that was spread, and it wasn't spread at that time by John McCain. In fact, it was rather shunned by him. But there was this rumor or conspiracy going around that one of the candidates, it's either McCain or Obama, was not born in the United States. And this is what I wanted to let you all know. And I'll pose a question, even if it's just rhetorical. Which candidate, as a matter of simple fact, which candidate, John McCain or Barack Obama, was not born in the United States? And if you say Obama, you are incorrect. It was John McCain. John McCain was born on a military base in Panama, and that counts as the constitutional requirement of being born in the United States. Just so you know the theory, the conspiracy theory that you may have heard, when Donald Trump, way before he ran for president, almost 20 years, not quite 20, but a full decade, he had spread a conspiracy, a rumor, a false accusation, and if you look it up, it's called the birther conspiracy. And what it is it was his theory that Obama was not born in the United States. And then when Obama won and became president, Trump continued with that conspiracy and said that, if Obama was not born in the U.S., it's the biggest scam in the history of American government. So there are people, and I think it's fair to say that this is a rational person could come to the conclusion that, which some people have or did, that why is it that the first person of color that's president of the United States has to essentially show his birth certificate when all of the presidents before who are white did not have that pressure. So Obama did eventually just release his long form birth certificate. Obviously, if you go to the DMV and you have to get a passport, they're going to ask you for the long version of your birth certificate. He was born in Hawaii. And I think one thing that I think we can all really respect is that, between Obama and McCain, they both were cordial, and McCain defended Obama by saying, we're not going to get into conspiracies. But that was the birther theory, and a lot of people consider it to be just thinly veiled racism. With that said, now let's move on to how long the president can serve. Now, a trick question I like to ask also is, what is the, one president, or actually, no, let's put it like this. If George Washington served 8 years, 2 terms, and now it's a constitutional law that a president only gets 2 terms, 8 years as president, then how is it that Franklin Delano Roosevelt won 4 presidential elections and unfortunately passed away during the final one? But how is this possible? Because the Constitution says, and I'll give you a hint, it says now it says that 8 years is the maximum. And that was not a law officially at the time when FDR ran for re-election. I kind of think of it as he's probably saying to himself, George Washington set the precedent of 8 years, the precedent being the word that means like a legal tradition. But it wasn't written down as a law. It wasn't codified as a law. So FDR kind of probably thought to himself, it's not my fault that I'm popular. I'm just going to keep running. And he did, and he kept winning. And so he served, he didn't complete his 4th term, but he got there. So that's fascinating. So after that, the Constitution was changed to make it official. 8 years, that's it, you're done, in terms of eligibility. Next, let's go to presidential powers. So I'm going to give you a couple that you may be familiar with and a couple that you may not know as much about. In no particular order, one of the things that the president can do, and I'll start with this one because we mentioned it in the last lecture, which was the ability to pardon people convicted of federal crimes. So there has been a lot of discussion. I think Will Hurd, who is a former Texas House of Representatives member, that was running against President Trump for the Republican nomination earlier this year. He didn't get very far, his campaign didn't, but he made this argument to Republicans to say, Trump is not running for you to save America or to make America great again. A Republican, Will Hurd, is saying that he's running to keep himself out of prison. And what Will Hurd was referencing was the fact that there's a possibility, at least hypothetically, that President Trump could win this election in the fall, and then January 20th, when he's sworn in, pardon himself of the 34 felonies he was just convicted of. That is a fascinating, wild political potentiality. So it could happen. We don't know. Democrats certainly would agree with Will Hurd, but Will Hurd was one of the few Republicans. I think also Chris Christie. If you don't know who these people are, you should look them up. They're what are called never Trump Republicans. They may have used to supported Trump, but they no longer do. Democrats would obviously agree with them. So let's move on. Pardon power, as we said, you don't really have, just to summarize, you don't really have to give a reason. Of course you will. You'll probably make a statement. So like, for example, Obama, in the last year of his second term, he set out a blanket sort of pardon to a class of thousands of non-violent drug offenders whose essentially only offense was to possess drugs out of federal prisons. So presidents can do it to make a point. They can also do it just because they like someone and they don't want them to get in trouble. With that said, let's go to the next one, and in no particular order, of course, but all of these are important. President has the power to do something called a veto. A veto is VETO. A veto is perhaps maybe the arguably one of the biggest rights a president has under the Constitution. And here's what it is. Congress, as we've learned a little bit about, and we're going to learn more about in the next lecture, Congress controls all federal money. So maybe right now the figures are around $5.5 trillion of tax money a year that Congress, and that rate obviously changes with time, but an enormous amount of money. Just to give you an idea how much money that is, just the amount of federal tax that Congress is able to spend and have the president sign into law or veto and deny. That's more than twice the entire gross domestic product of Russia. GDP is what that gross domestic product is abbreviated as. So with that said, that's a fascinating and important thing to consider in this, that if a president now, so a president can't spend money without Congress giving them the money. But what they can do is ask Congress to fund something that they think is important, and then if the bill comes to their desk, they sign it. It's immediately law. And since we're learning about veto, it's just the opposite. Veto just means Congress brings something to the president's desk. Both the House and Senate voted and passed it, and now the new, I'd say the final process is one of two things: either the president signs it or they veto it. Now, statistically, about a little bit over 95% of presidential vetoes end in that bill not becoming law. So the difference between a bill and a law obviously is just the president's signature. And as we'll learn, there is a second way to get a law made or passed without the president, and that is if the president vetoes it, says no, then Congress can go back and vote 2/3, 67% in the House and Senate. They can override the veto, which is saying no to the bill. They're overriding the no and saying yes anyway. That's very rare. It doesn't happen a lot. And if you wonder why, it has to go back to my corny joke that to get 67% of Congress to agree that the sky is blue or grass is green is very difficult. So it's not easy to get to that threshold of 2/3. Therefore, if a president says to the Congress, I'd like to give money, and by the way, I'm not taking a side whatsoever, but you saw on the news, of course, that the Prime Minister of Israel just spoke in front of Congress, and he was essentially appealing for more money for Israel. So let's just say, and again, we're not taking sides on this issue. We will talk deeply about that later, but it's just for the process of understanding a veto. If Biden says, "Okay, I'm wanting money given to me by you all in Congress, so I can sign it into law and give aid to Israel, also to Ukraine, for example." Those are the two main countries that the United States is very generous with in terms of financial and military aid. But let's say Congress says, well, we want to add into this bill aid to Israel and Ukraine, and the Republicans did this a little while ago. They said, we want to add some immigration money. So what that means is that there's a strictness about Trump and his policies, and the border is a big issue for Republicans, especially. It's salient. So they said to Biden, well, we won't give you the money for Israel and Ukraine unless you add or willing to sign into law, also money towards enforcing immigration laws on the border, specifically the border with Mexico. And then what ended up happening is, so President Biden is going to sign it. He says he's saying, okay, fine, I won't veto that. I don't really. He may or may not have wanted that in the bill, that immigration money, and it didn't have anything to do with Israel or Ukraine. It was just a Republican strategic way of sneaking in funding for something, not sneaking, but putting something into the funding that they thought was important, that wouldn't have passed on its own. So if they just said, here, President Biden, we want massive immigration enforcement, pass this bill, then he may veto that. But when it's combined with the aid for Israel and Ukraine, which Biden is extremely pro both of those countries, then it makes sense that Biden's like, okay, I'll just sign it. But then it never ended up getting signed that way, because what Trump did was, and this was very strategic, he essentially called the Republicans in Congress, not all of them, but the leadership especially, and said, don't give Biden funding for the border. And the reason was, even though this is an issue, he says, in every debate, every public appearance you can almost ever hear, he'll use these very intense words about his idea of what illegal immigration or undocumented peoples are causing, and he's very, very strict about it. So he calls and says to the Republicans in Congress who are about to give Biden this bill, that gave funding to the border and Ukraine and Israel, Trump convinced them not to give the aid to the border. And it's very simple. It's because if they did, then Biden would have more resources to put towards securing the border. And this is an election year, and Trump doesn't want Biden to look like he's doing something on immigration, because Trump's saying he ain't doing anything. So people are pouring through. You've heard the things that he says. It's none of my business whether you agree or disagree with his rhetoric, Donald Trump. But does that make sense? So strategically, he calls and says, Congress, he goes, Republicans, don't give this to Biden, because then it'll make him look good, like he's working on the immigration issue and getting something done. And one of the reasons I'm running is to criticize his handling of the border. Okay, next. Let's move on. So veto, that makes sense, hopefully. The next two are pretty interesting, and they both start with the same word. One is executive privilege, and one is the executive orders. Let's start with executive privilege. It's pretty simple. So there are situations in which the president is protected essentially 100% by law, about regarding information about national security secrets. So, for example, here's actually, let me tell the bad side of it, and then the good side of it. The bad side of it is when you say, Professor V, you're telling me that the president can legally withhold secrets from all of Congress, from all of the American people, and they just don't have to tell anyone. That seems like a recipe for a massive amount of fraud or corruption. That's a disaster. Why is that a law? Well, that's not what it's meant for. It's meant for one purpose only, and for your notes, this is really important. Executive privilege is only to be used when there's an issue of national security. That if the information that the president is keeping secret was released to the public, or even to Congress, or maybe even to their own spouse, hypothetically, if that information was released, it could endanger national security. So I'll give you a best example. I don't think anyone logically would disagree that an appropriate use of executive privilege was when, and this type of thing is probably the most secure thing for a president to be able to do, without having to worry about future impeachment or anything, which was Obama orders the assassination of Osama bin Laden. And it kind of worked out that there's SEAL Team 6, and they found him through his courier that was going into town for him, and in western Pakistan, as he had fled the border east through Afghanistan into West Pakistan. Um, it would not have been wise. It would have gotten people killed for Obama to say, okay, I'm getting a call right now, whatever time in the morning, that we can kill Osama bin Laden, but I don't want to keep secrets, so I'm going to call all 100 members of the Senate. I'm going to call all 435 members of the House. I'm going to go on TV in front of the American people. I'm going to tell the world, I don't want to keep secrets. We're about to kill Osama bin Laden, guys. Okay, that's never going to happen. And does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. That is not logical, and it would be the military members would get killed, perhaps. Their situation, they'd be massively endangered. So that's the only reason for executive privilege to be legally used. Although I'll tell you a quick interesting story about someone you may have heard of as among the most corrupt presidents in history, Nixon. Richard Nixon was using executive privilege in a way that was completely corrupt. And what happened was he had recorded himself committing crimes. The Watergate scandal in the United States, if you hear any scandal at all, people just add the letter or the word gate to the end. So, like, Pizzagate, I'll talk to you guys about that later. You could Google Alex Jones and Pizzagate. There was a Tom Brady and Deflategate. They deflated footballs. Well, why do we always say gate for everything? Well, because Watergate was the hotel where Nixon had, operatives break in to find information that the Democrats had so that he could win the next election. They were caught. The people nowadays, it would have been, he might have gotten away with it because it would all have been digitalized, and you just need someone to hack it. But this is back before the internet, so he's now in a situation where the people that he hired to go do this have been caught. They're now like in legal trouble, and he's recording himself all through the Oval Office in the White House saying things like, you know, let's reach out to their families, tell them to shush, not say anything, and we'll get millions of dollars. We'll take care of it. Let's just let this blow over, and please don't say anything to the press. So eventually, word came out. Famously, there's a congressman, Mr. Butterfield, that was that revealed on the Congress floor that Nixon had been recording things, and including the criminality. So at that point, Congress said, you need to give us the tapes. We need to hear the audio of what you're accused of, because if you didn't do it, then why wouldn't you share it? If you're saying I'm not a crook, which is a famous statement he made, I'm not a crook, well then why wouldn't you release the tape? So he didn't release the tape, and he said, this is executive privilege. This is national security secrets. Sorry, Nixon. No, it ain't. That's saving yourself politically. That is not saving the country from a national security threat. So thankfully, the Supreme Court overwhelmingly forced Richard Nixon to give the tapes, to make them public. And once that happened, it's almost as soon as the Supreme Court decided he had to release those tapes, that was it for him. He packed up and he resigned in absolute disgrace. Most people think that maybe don't know as much as y'all do about politics, that that Nixon was impeached and removed from office, which is called the conviction part in the Senate. No, it's never happened. No president has ever been impeached and convicted, and we'll talk about what that means next class when we talk about Congress more. But long story short, the executive privilege doesn't apply to things like what Nixon was trying to make it apply to. That's the horrible use of it, and that's the abuse of it. On the other hand, if there's a terrorist that the U.S. is going to take out. They're not going to. President Obama or Trump or whoever is not going to call a press conference and announce that. It doesn't make sense, and it wouldn't be wise. Next, executive orders. I'm going to give you a couple examples. I'm going to give you probably my least favorite executive order of all time among them, and my most favorite one. And you don't have to agree and have your favorites, but you may once you hear about them. So executive order, first of all, what it is it's a presidential proclamation of law. There's a fancy word you could use, and that is to promulgate. To promulgate something is to broadcast it, a loud message, so to speak. What we're learning right now is the president has the power to just write down new law and proclaim it in this thing called an executive order. That sounds really that sounds like the opposite of separation of powers and checks and balances and Congress being and the Supreme Court being able to stop that type of almost dictatorship. What is it? What are we talking about? Well, there's good news if you're worried about that. If executive orders were just like foolproof, there's no way to stop them, then it would be like a dictatorship. It would be very different. But what it is this. So executive orders proclaiming law, and I'll give you my favorite example. The idea of the Emancipation Proclamation, and generally just for the sake of understanding the basics, as you probably already do. Slavery is happening. At some point, Abraham Lincoln doesn't want to wait on Congress, and it just says, "Hey, slaves are free." And the Emancipation Proclamation, I'm sure you've learned about it, was ultimately a massive thing for our country in the best way. It took a while, and then we'll learn later about Juneteenth, because there was a lot of southern states that didn't immediately obey the executive order. But so that's an example of an executive order that can have immediate positive impact. An example that this is probably my least favorite executive order among them. During World War II, after remember we said FDR was president for 4 terms, although he passed in his 4th. He was president when Japan attacked the United States' base at Pearl Harbor. So as a result, FDR did something that I think historically is going to be, or it already is viewed as blatantly racist and unconstitutional. And that was that he made an executive order after Pearl Harbor, right after pretty much, to round up all people of Japanese ancestry and to put them in essentially prison camps. So let me say it again. The President of the United States is proclaiming law that if you are of a certain race, you have to go to prison or a prison camp or something like that. That's the definition of racial profiling. That's, just to be blunt, it's an absolute outrage. I mean, there's no constitutional backing for that. I don't think there are probably anybody that could argue. And that case is called Korematsu versus the United States. Korematsu versus the United States. And now we move to the next point. Why is there a Supreme Court ruling about something the president proclaimed? Well, remember, there's good news about these executive orders, that they are stoppable. There is a way to stop them. And for example, in this case, the first thing that could have happened is that Congress could have said, we're not giving you money, President FDR, to do the rounding up. We won't fund it. If that were the case, so if for your notes, here's what you could say. First way to stop an executive order. The order doesn't matter, but just to get three important points. There's 3 ways to stop an executive order. Number 1, Congress won't fund it. They won't give money to it. They won't give the president money. Can't sign it into law because they're not giving it to him. Second, and this is really fascinating as well, The next president could come and overturn the executive order, make one exact opposite, or just get rid of it. That happened a lot when Obama became president after, actually it did with Obama, but it also became popular, especially with Trump, after Obama, and then Biden after Trump. So executive orders can be canceled out two ways so far. Congress doesn't fund it, so it can't happen. If it requires money, it can't happen. Number two, the next president stops it. But in this case, now those two problems are obsolete because Congress is going to fund FDR's racist executive order to round people up based on their ethnicity. The next president, it's going to be too late by then. That will no longer be pertinent. So it's too little, too late. So there's a third way that this rounding up of Japanese people in a Japanese ancestry. There's another way it could have been stopped, and that was the Korematsu versus the United States case, which was the Supreme Court justifying and allowing and agreeing that FDR and by default Congress had the right to fund and actually do the task of rounding up people based on their race. And their justification, it's a long court case, but if you ever want to read it, it's fascinating and horrifying. The Supreme Court basically justified it by saying this is wartime, and that's just what happens in wartime. The presidents need extra powers to keep everyone safe, so we defer to the president. So that's my least favorite executive order I can think of. I'll give you one more, and this one's fascinating because with McCain and Obama running against each other in 2008, they agreed on a couple things, and one was they were against torture. And you guys know after 9/11 that torture became somewhat of a policy of the United States in a place called Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, and it's a military base for the United States in Cuba. And what you need to know about this, it's really important. Last class I told a story about me going to Jamaica and buying a Cuban buying a Cuban cigar, and not being able to bring it home. Well, in this case, don't get distracted by why do we have a military base in Cuba? I thought we hated them. The only reason that this is significant is and it would be the same anywhere else in the world that we could do it, the United States government, is that this is happening outside of the boundaries of the United States. And you might say, okay, so what's happening outside of the boundaries of the United States? Well, Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, was, again, a military base in Cuba, and it doesn't matter that it was in Cuba, it just needs to be out of the U.S. Well, why? Well, because that way, the Bush administration argued that there wouldn't be constitutional rights given to people accused of terrorism, so they don't get a lawyer. They're not necessarily told what they're charged with. They don't get a trial. They don't get a jury of their peers. They don't get a public and speedy trial, for that matter. There are people who were taken there from Afghanistan that someone said, so-and-so is a terrorist. U.S. invades. U.S. is giving out money for people to report terrorism so that the United States military can send them to Guantanamo Bay. So some people are there that were actual terrorists, and some were alleged terrorists and didn't do anything wrong and were profiled similar to Korematsu. But then again, this is the resolution. 2008 comes, and Obama and McCain agree on something, that they want to close Guantanamo Bay down. They don't want to do this anymore. Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize as he ended up becoming president, which is almost a first. But then, to McCain's credit as well on this issue, McCain was tortured. McCain was tortured for years in Vietnam. In fact, just a quick little story to the side. So he obviously opposed, McCain opposed torture because he had been tortured, and he and Obama both said, America's better than this. We can give justice without doing what we're doing. We want to stoop to their level. My mom used to say, if someone goes down in the gutter, don't get down there with them. Don't. So both of Obama and McCain want to take the high road. One just quick story about John McCain, if you didn't know. So I was saying he was shot down in over Vietnam and became a prisoner of war there, and was tortured. Well, later, when McCain, who was the 2008 nominee and a very prominent and powerful Republican, 8 years later comes after Obama's term is done, and Trump is running for president. Now, McCain isn't going to run again. Usually, you lose and you kind of, okay, I'm going to stay a senator in this case for him. But at this point, Trump ends up sort of having a rift with McCain. And a journalist is interviewing Trump and basically asks him, you've said more or less that John McCain is a loser. How can you say that about him? Because, he was a war hero. So how could you, how could you say that? And Trump said he's not a war hero to the journalist. And the journalist kind of gave another counter question. Well, you're talking about a person who's been tortured for the United States. How is this person not a hero? And Trump's response was famously, he was a war hero because he got captured. I like people who are not captured. So, as you can imagine, John McCain wasn't a big fan of Donald Trump after that. That's a phrase that I think will go down in history as a very big turning point, because essentially what had happened is you're saying that somebody isn't a war hero. They're only a war hero because they got captured. I like people who weren't captured. That really shifted the way the Republican Party was talking about people in the military. Even if it was just one statement, that was a big. I'll just say this, that was a very big moment in American history for that to be said. With all that behind us, let's keep going. But so far, so good. With Obama and McCain, real quick, back to the executive order. Obama wins the presidency, and just like McCain, he said either of them. They said whoever wins, we're going to do the first thing we're going to do is we're going to close Guantanamo Bay down. So in 2006, there was already a court case called Hamdan versus Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense of the United States, and Hamdan was somebody being held in Guantanamo Bay who said they were innocent. And they hadn't been given a lawyer. They had been tortured. They had no jury. They hadn't have hearings or ability to call witnesses, to subpoena, no habeas corpus, etc. So basically, no rights whatsoever. And the Supreme Court in 2006 actually ruled that Hamdan was right and that the U.S. government and Rumsfeld were wrong. So this is what's really fascinating about this. So now we have a situation where the person who really pumped up Guantanamo Bay post 9/11, President George W. Bush, is now given he doesn't leave the office until early 2009, but for the sake of it, the elections in 2008. So he's got 2 years. In 2006, he's got 2 years to close the thing down like the Supreme Court said to do, but he didn't. And then Obama comes in and wins, and he says, I'm going to sign executive order almost immediately that closes Guantanamo Bay. So here's the thing that's going to surprise you about this, and it's a fascinating example of executive orders. So first, the Supreme Court said, close it down. Second, President Obama comes in and says, we're closing it down by executive order. So why, Professor B, is it still open right now? The reason is because Congress didn't give the money to President Obama to move people out of that base into another space where they could have due process. And so Guantanamo Bay remains open to this day. Isn't that fascinating? So And then we've got really one more major category with presidents that they get to do, and that is hiring and firing power. But as you write your notes here, it's important to note that the firing power and hiring power have one key difference. So first, let's say, who does the president get to hire? Well, the president gets to hire a lot of people. So for example, and these are the big ones, the Attorney General of the United States, the Director of the FBI, the Director of the CIA, um, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Urban Housing and Urban Development, the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Energy. Are you bored yet? This goes on. I mean, the Secretary of Homeland Security. This is a massive hiring list that the president gets to do. Those people are generally referred to as the cabinet, especially the secretaries that we mentioned. The cabinet essentially means there's no way one president can be an expert at everything. So if they're able to hire people to work in the government that are experts at, say, diplomacy, which is what the Secretary of State would be doing, is trying to avoid war and to be really, looking for peace or alliances. So the way this works is the president gets to hire them. But here's the thing, and this is for your notes: the difference between hiring and firing power of the president. When they're being hired, so say the Secretary of State right now, or the head of whoever, FBI, any of the agencies, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But say president nominates this person to this position, and the Senate, then, this is the part that's important, then the Senate, not the House, just the Senate, of the 100 members vote yes or no to confirm that person and to have them be officially appointed. So the president nominates, the Senate says yes, and then they are appointed. And there's one more big one, and I cannot tell you how big this is. I'd argue this might be, it's all a little subjective in opinion, but it might be the biggest power of the president to be able to put people on the Supreme Court. And the reason is because the person that's on the Supreme Court, no one in the history of the United States that's ever been on the Supreme Court has been impeached and removed from the Supreme Court. So every single person on the Supreme Court ever in the history of the United States, every single one, has only left on their own volunteer, I want to go play golf and spend more time with my kids, or when they passed away. So stay with me. Why do I say this might be the biggest presidential power? Because Trump came in and had 3 Supreme Court justices he was able to appoint. And so out of the 9, you're talking, if Trump doesn't win again and never is president again, he still has those 3 members on the Supreme Court, and they're not supposed to be loyal to him, and they're not supposed to be loyal to a party, but they're conservative, and that's why he picked them. In fact, before he was running for office, or as he was running in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, he basically asked the conservatives, give me a list of the Supreme Court justices that you would like to see on the court. Give me a list. I'll whittle it down. I'll put whoever you want on there. And that was kind of a way that especially evangelical Christian voters, who are really important to the Republican electorate to be able to win elections, those evangelical Christians who were starting to distance themselves in polls from, Trump because of some of the more controversial things he said, now they have a promise that they're going to get these justices that, and this is exactly what happened, would overturn Roe versus Wade. And that's what we talked about last class as well. So that's a fascinating thing to think about, that when you have someone on the Supreme Court, they're there for life. Unless they die or retire, they get to chill. They get to stay. They get to be in power. Not a bad job security, is it? Pretty nice. So here's the difference, though, important for your notes right now. And that is that the Supreme Court nominees that are then voted in by the Senate, and it's not 67 votes, it's just a simple majority is all that's needed. Once the Supreme Court justice is past the Senate and they're officially a justice, they cannot be fired. The president cannot fire them no matter what. There's nothing the president can do. Once they're on, even if they don't like them, they don't like how they turned out or what they're ruling, untouchable by the president is the Supreme Court. But, and now for your notes, this is the difference. For all the cabinet positions I just said about Secretary of State, Defense, etc., those all have to be confirmed by the Senate, yes. Simple majority, just like the Supreme Court, yes. But, unlike the Supreme Court, the president can fire any or all of them without having to ask the Senate's permission. Basically, the Senate has to say permission to get in that position. But once the person is in that position, the president can fire all of them in one day if they want. Now, obviously, it doesn't really probably ever going to happen. But the point being what? Trump, for example, when he first came in, pretty quickly in his term in 2017, fired the head of the FBI, James Comey. He fired him, and he didn't have to give an explanation. He didn't have to legally justify it. Now he did. He said it was a little bit almost funny to hear, unless he really meant it, who knows. But he said that the reason he fired James Comey was not because the FBI director was investigating him about potential collusion with Russia in order to beat Hillary Clinton. Trump said, that's not why I'm firing him. Not that because he's investigating me. I'm firing him because he was so mean to Hillary Clinton. So but what's the point? You don't have to give really a reason. Even the presidents will say whatever they say. The person's fired. Now we start over again. Trump also fired, for example, the Secretary of State at the time when he was president. It was Rex Tillerson. He pretty much got fired by tweet when he was in Africa at a summit. That's how much firing power the president has. Isn't that fascinating? It's remarkable. But the hiring power has to go through the Senate, and I would argue that's a really, really good thing. You may get people in those positions you don't like, but at least there's 100 people debating it, and it's not just no matter what the president wants, they're automatically in. With that said, I'm gonna have a summary here, and we'll sign off and see each other next time for learning about Congress and the judicial branch. But essentially, presidents, I think you could add just one more thing that's kind of not in the Constitution, but it's very evident, and that is there's a funny word or term in political science, and it's called the bully pulpit. The bully pulpit doesn't necessarily mean that as a president you have to bully people or that every president does bully people, although some have certainly bullied people. The bully pulpit means this. There's 535 members of Congress. If somebody tries to call a press conference, unless it's the Speaker of the House or something, there's not going to be press for that. Maybe it'll be findable on C-SPAN, and somebody will carry it. But if a president calls a press conference, they have that bully pulpit. And really, what that means, if you want to write down for your notes, it just means that they have the biggest microphone. It's one person, one big moment of almost doing. Not whatever you want, but hopefully that makes sense. So the bully pulpit is a place to say what you want to say, and even if maybe the press is not normally going to cover a congressional press conference, the president's one person, and they can command that bully pulpit the way that they want. And it's done differently by different presidents. Trump's an interesting strategy at first was to avoid a lot of press conferences and just tweet directly to the people. but you don't have to face the press if you don't want as president. But the final thing we're going to learn is the president does need to do one thing according to the Constitution in terms of speaking, and that is to give a State of the Union address. And a State of the Union address, the Constitution says, should be given from time to time. The way that plays out is that usually every early winter, or late winter, or before the spring, February, March, there's a presidential State of the Union address, and everyone that is anyone in power basically is there. So you have 100 senators there. You have 435 members of the House. You have oftentimes several members of the Supreme Court, though nine of them almost would never all show up. For one reason was because if God forbid there's some type of explosion at that building, and you have every single Supreme Court justice and everyone in power that's immediately killed, that would be an absolute chaos ensuing event. So actually, that's probably like the most secure event, maybe in the world. And there's actually somebody, a designated survivor, that could be like the Secretary of Agriculture or something, and they're hidden away elsewhere, secretly, so that just in case, God forbid, the worst happens, then, we have this person's now going to jump a lot of spots up the chain, and they're going to become president now. So, but aside from that, very unlikely, hopefully, a scenario of that happening, the State of the Union Constitution is saying to the president, tell the United States Congress and the American people how's the country doing? What's the state of our country? What's the state of our union at this time? And usually presidents will use it to make almost like a pep rally, like all the things they've done, and that's that bully pulpit. They got an hour and a half, forever long they want, to talk in front of the world, in every single station in the United States that isn't like sports channel or movie channel. It's going to be on the news everywhere. So once a year, that is a massive speech that the president gives, and it's usually, pretty partisan in terms of how people applaud. It's kind of sad to me, to be honest with you, but a lot of times, like, half the crowd will give a standing ovation, the crowd being Congress. If, say, Trump is president and he says something that Republicans agree with, all the Republicans will stand up and clap. And then if Biden gives one and he says something Democrats like, then all Republicans will stay seated, all Democrats will stand up and applaud. So it is unfortunately evident that there's partisanship, but once in a while you'll have both sides all stand up, and usually something like, let's honor this war hero, or something that at least has some common theme that is, even partisanship doesn't override. With that said, I'm gonna leave you all to go learn some more. When you do, if you want to, look up the case of Korematsu versus the United States. If you wanted to look up a little bit more about the Emancipation Proclamation, or the Obama's executive orders, or if you have any other things of this lecture that you think are interesting, feel free to either check them out yourself, or bring them to me, bring them to class, post on our discussions. Let's dialogue about this and debate, because I'll tell you, man, everyone here took this class at a really good time. You're not going to be bored. With this stuff, politics being what it is, the presidential race, for whatever we might think about it, has never been, for me, never been more fascinating. It's hard to predict, but now you know what the president's constitutional powers are. We'll sign off for today. Great to see everybody. We'll see y'all soon.